stuff. Now I'm going to do a little run through of what my process is. And I'm going to try and do it quickly because comics, it just has a lot of steps and I don't want it to seem like too much. So I don't want to overwhelm your brains. But the thing that makes comics feel a little daunting is that you have both words and pictures. And so to me, I like to think of it like you're a pendulum going between words and pictures. So some people start with words, some people start with pictures. Really, you can start wherever, but it's sort of like a dance. And sometimes you're working on both at the same time. So for me, I start with pictures because I think in pictures and that's how I learn. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see normally for my process, I like to draw my character first, because once I draw them and see them, then my imagination has a picture that it can start animating, because that's what happens is that in my head, I'm an animator. So I'll just sort of draw, I don't know, just play around with just drawing my character. So here's some like initial sketches of Mona, and sort of playing with how am I going to draw her and her matter interacting. And then the next one is more of like a mood board. You know, it's almost like this was an early version where the genius was like her pencil topper. Anyway, that idea changed. But it's the same idea of you're just sort of gathering your ingredients. Like, what is in my story? Like, you don't have to know the story, but just gather the ingredients and draw them together. And then your imagination can start to play with it. So normally after I start some sketches, then I'll start the writing process. Oh, writing. Writing is, most cartoonists, we don't like to write because we want to just draw, right? So I'll start off by writing, okay, what's going to be on the back of this book? Don't figure out what the whole book is, just what's like one paragraph, what in the industry we call the elevator pitch. So first I'll just write that and to figure out like, what's the blurry watercolor of this story? And then I'll work on an outline. So these are little snippets of like from Mona, what my process is. And so the outline is just, bullet point, super simple. But so we just did pictures into words. So now we're going to swing back to pictures. So in the next slide, you'll see my bulletin boards, because I have like 6 bulletin boards under my desk. And I use these to lay out all my books on, because since I'm a visual learner, I need to like see it. So I'll like lay out all the boards. And for working on my script, I use the boards to help me. So I sort of work on them at the same time. So this is like an early board where I printed off images, that I'd like drawn in my sketchbooks, because I just drew and drew and drew for years and filled a file cabinet. So now I have this whole file cabinet that I can just like, oh, we've already drawn about feeling anxious. And oh, we've already drawn about, feeling like you can't speak. And we've drawn about this. So that's why it's good to just make stuff and it makes sense later. So I'll start off with a lot of these moments, almost like I'm stringing them together like beads on a necklace. Because sometimes just organizing them, I learn, what the story is about. It's like, oh, I have all these scenes about water. Let's put them together. Because my ideas don't come in order a lot of times. It's more like lots of ideas at once instead of like this happens and this happens and this happens. So using cork boards really helps me organize ideas. Some people like to use Post-it notes, up on the wall. So like the next panel, you'll see what the boards look like later. I start to sort of sketch. This is when I'll start to like sketch things out and fill in the blanks more. Like, okay, if she feels like she has a storm in her chest, what in the story is making her feel like that? So this is what I use to help me make my scripts. So the next slide is like sort of what my scripts look like. And I'll talk more about like this process also a little later for you guys. So my scripts are super simple because I'm illustrating it. So I don't have to, I'm not going to be handing it off to someone else to draw. So I can keep my scripts pretty simple. I just write, what they say or what narration there is, and then what action is happening. And so with the scripts is when I start to sketch out what my layouts are going to look like. So you see there like all these little thumbnail sketches in my script. And because sometimes it's sort of like detangling a problem. Like you need to, how to tell a story in as few panels as possible. What panel can you leave out? And what panels you have to have in there. So this is where I'm really sort of running through it in my head. So like the next panel shows, what is the next one? I'm trying to remember my own slideshow. Oh yeah, so these are the thumbnails. So again, we're sort of going back and forth with words and pictures and words and pictures. So the thumbnails are what the bridge between script and thumbnails to me is the hardest part, is how to take that script and to plan out like that page, like what's basically what you guys are like working on right now. This is the hardest part. But one reason I like using these blue pencils is because it makes me feel like an architect, because I'm, you're building a world when you're doing the thumbnails. And so, yeah, generally like 5 or like 1, 2, 3. Yeah, that's like a 5-page example, 5-panel example. That's normally sort of my go-to how many panels I like to have. Because if I have like, I don't know, like 8 panels, it's like too many, and then they're like really little. So this is like a average sort of format for me. And with the thumbnails, the most important things for me to plan out are the faces and the speech bubbles. Because the faces and the speech bubbles are the things that I find people, when they read your comic, that's what they're looking at to sort of read the flow. So in thumbnail phase, those are the things I'm thinking about, like speech bubbles, faces. And we go to the next one. This is a step that you don't have to do, but if you're doing a larger project, like a graphic novel, I make a dummy. And so like this, I'm holding up, like, this is what the dummy looks like. It's a blow up of all my thumbnail sketches. And then I write in all the dialogue, so then you can actually read it. So this is a step for graphic novels, because since it's such a long project, I will give this to my trusted art nurse and basically say, tell me what's wrong with it. Tell me what's great about it. Tell me what's confusing. Tell me what's boring. And so my art nurse always give me the best advice. So it's only after editing that is then I'll draw it out. So this is often when I finally figure out what the book is actually about, because sometimes you don't really know what your story is about until you read it yourself. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, the drawing part's the fun part. It's like, oh, finally, drawing. So for my books, I like to do some sample art, because the first few times you draw a character, they change. It's like if you see early Simpsons, they look different than later Simpsons. So these are like some sample pieces I did before Mona. And if we go to the next slide. I know, I'm like, yeah, there's my cat, because every cartoonist has a cat. I thought he might appear, but he's asleep. Actually, there you can see revealed on the laptop, I'm using visual reference for drawing a car, because I cannot draw cars to save my life. Page by Page is set in New York, but remarkably has very few cars, if you'll notice. So yeah, so that's like, typical view in my studio. So I think the next slide has a little video, a little time lapse of drawing process. And drawing's like the fun part. All the stuff I just ran through, I mean, that's like the real work, behind a graphic novel. The drawing part is sort of like the reward. So first I line my page, like you just saw real fast with a ruler. And I actually blow up my thumbnails to trace them, because I find when the first time you sketch it out, it just has a certain spirit to it that I like to keep when I blow it up. And then penciling, man, it takes me like a while to pencil, because I'll sort of draw and erase and draw and erase and draw and erase multiple times. The dad character in Mona is based on my brother, and it's just funny because I've never seen him make that face. But this is a scene where Mona is like not feeling well, and the doctor's like, oh, you're fine. She's like, oh, I must be crazy. And oh, the shading is my favorite part. Oh, I love the shading, because then it's like you've drawn yourself a coloring book. You get to fill it in. Yeah, so I think inking and shading are my favorite parts to do. So I'll just do like a few layers of shading. Then I'll use white gouache as like my touch-up. Gouache is like a watercolor. So I'll use that to sort of clean up little things, like do little dots in the eyes and that sort of stuff.
Supplies, do we?
But that's,
Did you get us the supplies?
I did.
Oh, okay.
They are not here to finish. They should be here this afternoon. They didn't make it. So we'll be starting with regular pencil. Are all of our things in?
I don't think we should draw on our cardstock then, because
I
like drawing pencils. Like,
Yeah, I would save the Bristol board. I would save using that until, I don't draw on it until I planned everything out. And I've made all the decisions. So like there's my sort of art supply setup, right there. So there's like the tube of gouache and like the micron pens, and I like to use these erasable blue pencils just because
these for us to use. We
if
have
I was there in person, then I would have these there. And I use now. And if I was there, I was like, oh, I have a set of this watercolor graphite. So I use this, it's like a paintable graphite. So that's what I used for Mona. With the other books, I use India ink washes. But this is nice because you can like erase into it. Anyway, it's like nerding out. So I like to make my books by hand just because I like the physical process of working on paper. But I do like digital for the lettering. So I think the next panel shows that on the computer is where I will type, you can make a font of your handwriting. So I'll type my lettering and draw the speech bubbles separately so then I can layer those on top. Because that's also just helpful because then you don't have to paint around your speech bubbles. And also you can take the speech bubble out because the rule is if the panel works without the text, leave the text out because you want to have as little text as possible. So that's the game in comics, is how to show it and not say it. Because ideally you want the art to do the talking, which is why wordless comics are the hardest ones to do.